So since 1987, you have participated in all NPT review conferences. Which one would you describe as the most successful so far, and why?
Well, one needs to look at them from a different perspective. So as you know, the treaty needed to be extended in 1995 because the treaty initially had a life of only 25 years. So if we had not extended the treaty in 1995, you and I, we wouldn't be having this conversation because the NPT would no longer exist. So from one perspective, the 1995 conference was perhaps the most important conference because we had to decide on the future of the treaty. And so we did agree on indefinite extension. So the treaty was made of indefinite duration. It means that it will never expire. But in order to get all 179 countries who were at that time party to the treaty, today we have 191, but in 1995 we were 179. So we had to satisfy all of them. And many countries were concerned that, 25 years have passed since the treaty entered into force in 1970, and we still have thousands of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
The non-nuclear weapon states say, we have kept our promise. We have not developed nuclear weapons. We have IAEA safeguards. But the 5 nuclear weapon states, although they have done some disarmament, but they haven't disarmed completely. So why should we support this treaty? And then the Middle East countries said, well, we are in our region all party to the treaty, but we have one country in our region that is not party to the NPT and has nuclear weapons, and that is Israel. So for us, that is the most important thing. So that is why, as you know, we had to get this package of decisions. So we improved how we review the treaty. We had principles and objectives for non-proliferation and disarmament. We had the resolution on the Middle East to establish a nuclear weapon-free zone there. And then on the basis of these 3 pillars, so to speak, we extended the treaty indefinitely. So it was very important in that sense. Now, 2000 was very important because for the first time, the nuclear weapon states agreed to what we call the unequivocal commitment to nuclear disarmament. They had never said it before. They said we are implementing Article 6, and as you know, Article 6 says to do negotiations in good faith. There is no timeline. You can negotiate until the end of the world and say we are negotiating in good faith. And there's no timeline for that. There's no end result. So this was an important breakthrough. And also they broke the link that nuclear disarmament has to be agreed on its own without linking it to general and complete disarmament. So in that sense, 2000 was also a high watermark from a different point of view. My view for 2010 is a little bit different than what you would read. Many people regard 2010 to be a big success. It was a success, and we agreed on these 64 actions. 22 roughly in disarmament, roughly 22 in non-proliferation, and about the same number in peaceful uses. But some of the commitments from 2000 were watered down. So in that sense, it was some backsliding, but still we had 22 actions. So this is what we will review in January.
And do you think, like, if the treaty would be to extend it today, so countries need to agree on it now that the 25 years would pass and there would be no indefinite extension? Like, do you think it would be the same outcome that the states would agree on NPT treaty, or do you think that maybe because the nuclear weapon states are not fulfilling their promises, so it would be like delegitimized, or what do you think would be the evolution of the treaty?
Yeah, if we were doing it this year or even in 2020, I don't think we would get indefinite extension. Because in 1995, the 5 nuclear weapon states were more or less united. The Americans and the Russians were united. And as you know, the treaty was initially negotiated by the Soviet Union and the United States in 1967-68. But now the 5 nuclear weapon states are not united. We have this big problems between the United States and Russia, the United States and China. And they are, we are basically on the verge of a new Cold War. today, given the deterioration in relations between the two, first of all, between Russia and the US, who have 95 or 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So we had this summit in June in Geneva between the two presidents, Biden and Putin. But otherwise, the relationship is bad. And same thing with China. So I very much doubt today that if we had to take the decision on extending the treaty, we would get indefinite extension.
Mm-hmm.
So we were lucky that in 1995, the international, also it was very close to the end of the Cold War. Cold War ended in 1991, Soviet Union collapsed, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine that had Russian nuclear weapons gave them up. South Africa gave up its nuclear weapons, had a transition to a democratic government, joined the NPT. Argentina, Brazil had also given up nuclear weapon programs earlier. So the international climate was very much different. But over the years, the international climate has been steadily deteriorating. This is why the 2005 review conference failed. We had the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the agreement with North Korea and the United States, the agreed framework broke down in September 2002. Iran nuclear file began in August 2002. The Libyan nuclear issue came up in December 2003, I think. So the situation has been deteriorating. So we were lucky that in 2010, partly because we had the Obama administration, and in your city, Obama made this famous speech.
Yeah, that's right.
On giving up nuclear weapons in that square outside your foreign ministry. But then he didn't do anything about it, right? He just made the speech and there was no follow-up. But still, the good feeling for the Obama administration following the Bush administration, first time American president says publicly thinking about a future without nuclear weapons. So it improved the climate, and the US was in a more compromising mood in 2010, but it was not in 2015. And we very much doubt today that the Biden administration has changed policies from the Trump administration too much.
I have just like one question to this topic. Do you perceive that maybe if NPT wouldn't be indefinite, like now the nuclear weapon states have no incentive, or I mean, they prefer the status quo. And this is one of the, of course, this is delegitimizing for treaty because the non-nuclear weapon states are actually fulfilling their promises. So do you regard it in the same way that they actually have no ambition to change anything and they just like prefer it how it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's like, you know, which came first, chicken or the egg? So the nuclear weapon states say we cannot reduce nuclear weapons or disarm until we feel safe, until we have non-proliferation verified. And then the non-nuclear weapon states say, yeah, but your nuclear weapons, they threaten me. This is where the humanitarian initiative came about, starting in 2014. That, you know, we have at that time 15,000 nuclear weapons, and there could be an accidental use of nuclear weapons. We don't know. You know, now we have cyber threats and so on. And, you know, in human life, technology fails. We have accidents every day. Planes crash, trains crash. We drive into things. We slip on the pavement during the winter. So if we have so many nuclear weapons, because they are made by humans and they are controlled by humans, there's a chance of an accident. And even though they are your nuclear weapons, they will still affect me. And then, you know, the people in Kazakhstan, in the South Pacific, in Nevada, in Australia, in Algeria, where these countries tested their nuclear weapons, these people are speaking up. They're saying we suffered genetic damage. And, you know, if you've seen pictures of some of the people in Kazakhstan, where pregnant women were affected by the radiation and their fetuses were horribly deformed. The same thing in the South Pacific and so on. So these people suddenly got a voice that, you know, even though they're your nuclear weapons, but I, who have nothing to do with your nuclear weapons, have been affected. You tested the nuclear weapons on my territory, my islands, without my permission. and you left behind this radiological legacy. So it's becoming very difficult for the nuclear weapon states to keep on justifying that my nuclear weapons are my nuclear weapons and they provide for the security of everyone. Now, this is what French President Macron is saying. French nuclear weapons provide security to the European Union. And some European Union countries say no. But you may not like the following comment, but some East European countries are also playing this up, particularly Czech Republic and Poland, with regard to Russia, NATO, EU, and so on. Because there are some forces who say, well, take the nuclear weapons out of Germany. And apparently I hear that some people in the Polish government say, well, fine, if they take them out of Germany, you bring them to Poland. We're happy to have them here to deter. So it's not a very easy question. But what's problematic is that starting in 2018, under the Trump administration, they came up with a new proposal called Creating the Conditions for Nuclear Disarmament, which means that you, the non-nuclear weapon states, 186 of you, you first have to create the conditions where I, with my 7,000 nuclear weapons, feel secure to go down to fewer nuclear weapons. So there has been a pushback against that. And just as the Middle East issue, as we discussed, have such extreme views, it's the same on nuclear disarmament. So if we didn't have the very important point to remember for the NPT is that NPT PrepComs and review conferences are the only forum where the 5 nuclear weapon states feel pressured to answer questions on their nuclear weapons policies. They do not do it in any other forum. The Russians and Americans might do it bilaterally, but we don't know what they're discussing. Mm-hmm. So if there were no NPT, the non-nuclear weapon states would have no forum in which to challenge the nuclear weapon states and ask them to explain. And then Article 6 is the only international obligation that the 5 nuclear weapon states have to reduce nuclear weapons and to work on nuclear disarmament. So they would be free of that obligation without the NPT. Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the conference, the states are supposed to agree to accept or to find a consensus and they to find a shape of final document. Do you have any suggestions for language in the final document that would help to reconcile the demands of the nuclear weapon states on one side and the TPNW proponents on the other side?
Yes. So as we discussed, 2020 is 50 years since the NPT entered into force. So if there was no COVID, we would have had this big conference in 2020, celebrating 50 years of NPT in force and 25 years of indefinite extension. So at that time, the idea was to make this a high-level opening of the review conference and have presidents and prime ministers come to recognize the 50th anniversary. And so then they said, well, if we have prime ministers and presidents coming, then we should have a high-level declaration. Otherwise, presidents and prime ministers don't come until you get a declaration or a statement at their level. And then some people said, well, given that already the relationship between the US and Russia and US and China is going bad, only this high-level declaration or statement, we should be happy with getting one of these, and that should be it. And then other people said, well, if this is it, then we should finish the review conference in 3 days, because the presidents and prime ministers will leave. We have this high-level declaration. Then why do we want to spend another month in New York negotiating? Because if we're not going to get anything, why are we wasting our time and money? And then other people said, no, whether we have a declaration or not, we want a final document, the way we were discussing a little while ago. So now if you look at the literature, people are providing different options. A, to have a high-level declaration or statement, and that should be it. Second is some sort of a hybrid thing, some sort of a statement and some sort of a report by the president of the conference. And the third option is to have a normal statement, a normal final document. So the president says that he wants a normal final document, traditional final document. But we will find out once the conference opens, at what level it opens. Given this new Omicron thing, I think it's unlikely that many presidents and prime ministers are going to fly to New York for 1 day or 2 days in this current situation. So this is a question mark. Now, as regards reference to the TPNW, the TPNW state's position is that we do not want to make this an issue at the review conference. We want you to recognize reality. 122 states supported it, 86 states have signed it as of now, 56 states have ratified it, the treaty has entered into force. So we would like some recognition of this treaty in the language. But the other side says, no, this treaty contradicts and undermines the NPT. We do not recognize this. It will not lead to nuclear disarmament. It is a distraction, so we want no reference to it. So there needs to be some compromise on how much reference is acceptable. And so again, this we will find out once the review conference opens.
I was also wondering about the schedule. It seems to be like quite tight. I mean, there are 24 days to
20 days.
20 days.
I mean, of the review con. Oh, you mean 24 days till the review conference?
I mean, it begins on the 4th and it ends on 28th. So like.
Yeah, but you have weekends. So you only have.
yeah, you are right.
You actually have 18 or 19 working days, because if we don't start on a Monday, we start on a Tuesday.
But then actually that's even less. So that's
really so it's 19. Normally it's Monday to Friday, 4 weeks. So that's 20 working days.
Yes, you're right.
So now it's 19. Yeah.
And do you then think the delegates have enough time to find consensus?
This is always the complaint. We didn't have enough time. So, in the first week, you have all these big statements. Everyone wants to speak because they want their picture on the TV that they can show at home to their family and their friends. I was at the General Assembly speaking at the NPT. Here's my picture. And you also in the records. Then every main committee also has opening statements. So you repeat the same thing that you said in your original opening statement 3 times. So you waste a lot of time. Then we have the main committee meetings and subsidiary bodies. Now, nuclear disarmament, of course, is so emotional that one never runs out of things to say. But in the other 2 main committees, after a while, they don't have anything to say. And you are in New York. You have to go shopping. So, we have nothing to do, so we end the meeting today at early when we go shopping. Of course, they don't say that, but that's really what it is. So if that's what you're going to do, then obviously you're not going to have time at the end. Now, the delegates don't like me saying that. But as I mentioned, I've been at every NPT meeting, RevCon and review conferences, 87, I know. And I personally have been asking to move the review conference to Vienna. But some people want to go to New York because they can buy an iPhone cheaper. So you can probably buy the iPhone in Prague or Vienna or in New York for roughly the same price.
Yeah.
It's not that much. So there are many other motivations. It's not just NPT that is there. I mean, these are not the most important, but we should not ignore some personal motivations. So it is never a matter of time. It is how you use the time you have, right? We know how many days we have. It's not a secret. It's not a mystery. So we know how many hours of the day we have in the UN for negotiations. That is also not a rocket science. It's not mystery. We know how much time each main committee, each subsidiary body has. So if we misuse our time, then it's our fault. This is what I said. They blame the process.
Yeah.
We didn't have time. The process is not good. But if your position is such that one doesn't want to compromise or one doesn't want to accept the other side's position, then you're never going to agree. So time is, in my view, has never been the issue. It's just an excuse for not agreeing, and it's also an excuse for wasting time.
Mhm.
I mean, why cannot they finish a review conference earlier, right? No, if they were so determined, and if it's so NPT is so important to you and all of us, then why don't we negotiate and make compromises and finish the review conference? And we don't have to be there for 20 days. Yeah. So we waste time, we drag things out, we fight till it's crazy, and then at the end we say, sorry, we could have agreed, we ran out of time.
Mm.
Now, in the old days, you could actually negotiate all the way through the night. In 1995, we only were getting 4 hours of sleep.
Mhm.
But then I think starting in 2005 or so the UN changed its rules. They said if you want to have a meeting outside normal times, you have to pay for the security and so on. And then nobody wanted to pay. So now the meetings are regular hours, 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock roughly, and 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock.
Mhm.
So that's 6 hours a day of official meetings. And then you have a 2-hour lunch break. So if you wanted to agree, that's enough time to negotiate seriously and agree. Diplomats like to talk. They want to make long speeches. Partly it's wasting time. Nowadays it happens less, but in the old days, some diplomats would start quoting in Latin, those that were lawyers. And then they would not translate. And this was their way of showing superiority. I am well educated. I'm a lawyer. You know, so who are you? So there are so many aspects to it that we can only discuss those things. People don't write about them. So you really have to go to one of these things to witness. So complaining about time is really, in my view, a low blow.
Mhm. So it all like basically depends on the ambition, what wants to be implemented and what is the position. And then if there is consensus, then the time is found, but otherwise, yeah, I understand. Yeah. Okay, we are almost like at the end of our interview. I have the last 2 questions for you. And firstly, I wanted to ask, what is there for the future NPT review conferences? Do you see it more like feasible if now the nuclear like weapon states, they negotiate or they coordinate the things on the bilateral level, or should it be only like multilateral? What do you think is the best strategy like to really go forward with non-proliferation and disarmament?
Well, all agreements between Moscow and Washington starting from the mid-1960s have been done bilaterally. None, if you read all of these agreements, including New START, there is no reference to the NPT or Article 6. This is purely bilateral security issue. Now, some years ago, it was actually Russia, President Putin, who said China should be at the table. And the Americans at that time said no. And now it's the other way around. Now the Americans want China to be at the table and the Russians said no. Or if the Chinese are to be at the table, what about the British and the French? So I don't think the time at the moment is right. Last year, when the US and the Russians were doing some negotiations here in Vienna, the Americans set up the meeting room with 3 sides. And on one side, they put the table and chairs and flags for China. And then China said, we told you we are not coming. Why are you doing this? And then the Russians said, well, unless you take away the Chinese flags, we are not coming into the room because China is not coming. So why are we going through this theater? So the Chinese have said no. The Chinese position is that the Russians and Americans have so many more nuclear weapons. When they are down to the size of the Chinese arsenal, then China is willing to negotiate with them. The British and the French say, we are already very low, 200 weapons or something like that. So don't come and talk to us. We've done our bit. So I don't see any multilateral thing. The nuclear weapon, the Russians and Americans will always come to the NPT and say, see, we have signed the New START. We have extended New START. We have reduced our nuclear weapons by 80% over the higher numbers we had of 60,000, 70,000 during the 80s. So we are disarming, and the non-nuclear weapon states say yes, but you need to do more. So you know, it's not getting us anywhere. So I don't personally see multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations happening anywhere.
So maybe like in the future, long future, but yeah, not right now. And also, could you please comment on North Korea?
Yes. So in my view, North Korea represents a big failure of the US in particular in dealing with the North Korean file. So under the Clinton administration, so North Korean issue started in 1994 when the IAEA did its first inspections in North Korea, and it found that the North Korean declarations on producing plutonium were not complete. So then when the IAEA wanted to do more inspections, the North Koreans said no. So this created a crisis. So then there were direct negotiations bilaterally between North Korea and the US, and they came up with what is called the agreed framework. North Korea also gave notice under the NPT, 3-month notice to leave the NPT. Every arms control treaty has a withdrawal clause. So on the 89th day of the 3-month notice of withdrawal, North Korea and the US had this agreed framework. So North Korea said, okay, I stopped the clock. And the clock on leaving the NPT is stopped, and agreed framework comes into play. So it came into play in 1994, under which North Korea froze its nuclear program, allowed IAEA inspections to continue. In return, the US, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, they formed a consortium that they would build 2 light water reactors for generation of electricity in North Korea, because North Korea was shutting down its other reactors, which they said were for generating electricity. And during the time these reactors would be built, North Korea would be supplied 500,000 tons of heavy oil to run oil-fired plants to generate electricity. But then Clinton lost control of Congress, and they cut off the money for the 500,000 tons of oil. So in that winter was a very cold winter with no oil coming to North Korea, nuclear plants closed down. So many thousands of North Koreans froze to death. So North Korea blamed the US for violating the agreed framework. And the US said, well, you know, under our system, if Congress cuts the money off, the president cannot write a check. And North Korea said, well, that's not my problem, that's your problem. So by the time Japan and the European Union collected the money to provide oil, the winter was already over. So already we have a problem now. So the agreed framework continued until 2002. Then when the Bush administration came in, they challenged the North Koreans and accused them of violating the agreed framework, of having uranium enrichment in addition to plutonium separation. So this agreed framework started collapsing in September 2002, and they asked IAEA inspectors to leave in December 2002. And on the 10th of January 2003, North Korea said, remember, we stopped the clock on the 89th day. So I pressed the button, and starting from tomorrow, I'm out of the NPT because it will be 90 days. So they left the NPT. And without going into too much more details, because we don't have time, we had 6-party talks. Nonetheless, North Korea carried out its first nuclear explosion in 2006. And it has carried out 6 nuclear tests, the last ones being in 2017. So the international community imposing sanctions and shouting at North Korea, you cannot have nuclear weapons, hasn't worked. Sanctions for nuclear issues have never worked. They never worked on South Africa, they didn't work on Pakistan, they didn't work on Iran, they didn't work on India. So why are countries following a policy that has failed? And it is failing on Iran as well today. sanctions are not succeeding. They didn't succeed in North Korea. So here, I think one should give credit to President Trump because he held these 3 summits with the North Korean leaders, starting in Singapore, then in Hanoi, and then in Panmunjom. Now, according to reports in the Hanoi summit, North Korea agreed to dismantle the Yongbyon nuclear facility in North Korea, which has 80% of North Korean nuclear facilities, in return for removal of all sanctions. But the Trump administration said, no, you first dismantle your facility and then we will resume sanctions. Then we will take away sanctions. But by then, North Korea had already seen that the United States had walked out of the JCPOA. Iran was implementing the JCPOA, but the US walked out of it. So North Korea had no incentive. So this was a missed opportunity. And since then, it's the same old policy. The Biden administration shouting at North Korea, give up your nuclear weapons, hasn't worked, will not work. So we need to have a realistic policy where just as countries reluctantly accepted Israel, then India, then Pakistan, we need to accept North Korea, unfortunately, and make an agreement that it does not make its nuclear program bigger and contain it at that. And then we can see how we can work towards resolving the issue of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And my final comment is nuclear weapons were not introduced in the Korean Peninsula by North Korea. During the Korean War, the US threatened to nuke North Korea 3 times. The general commanding American Air Force, he is on record. He said, we bombed everything there was to bomb in North Korea and then some more. So 25% of the population of North Korea was killed in the Korean War. Then the United States put US nuclear weapons in South Korea. There was no North Korean nuclear weapon program at that time. So unfortunately, many of the writings that we read forget about this history. Countries are not crazy to develop nuclear weapons. Some countries develop it for prestige regions, other countries develop it for what they feel is their security. And we have to deal with that issue. So until we deal with North Korea realistically, we are stuck. And who is suffering? It's the people of North Korea who have no voice because it's not a democratic system. So they are innocent victims. They are starving. They are having a hard time getting COVID vaccine. It has not changed the policy of the government one bit. So we on our side in the West can have this moral superiority of lecturing to the Iranians and so on, but it's the people who suffer, the governments don't change. And as I mentioned, we cannot point a single success using the policy of pressure and sanctions to reverse a nuclear weapon program.
Thank you for commenting on that.